One of the things that we love to talk about on this channel is genres for your upcoming game. The most obvious one, of course, is the 3 different tier lists we've made at this point, talking about what are the best and the worst genres that you should make for your first games. Maybe you should make strategy, maybe you should make platformers, maybe you should make 4X. We've gone through them all before. If you have never watched them before, they're really entertaining and give you some more insights into specific genres, what makes them good and bad for indie developers. But we'll never be able to cover every genre. And in this video, I want to give you a bit of the thought process that we use to determine what is a good genre for an indie developer. What is a genre they should go for and they shouldn't go for. And my approach here is to break down what even is a genre, what are the different parts that matter for a game developer. So I'm not going to include like how fun and like personal affinity that your players may have with a game. I'm just going to be talking purely about, okay, hey, how do I determine if a genre is a good fit for me as my studio? Maybe there's a good market fit, yes or no. A bit of all of that more to figure out what is a good genre, what is a bad genre. And it comes down to breaking a genre into 7 different building blocks. These are the various things that you should consider when choosing a genre. And the first one, and probably one of the most obvious ones, is complexity in terms of mechanics. I know you guys are mainly programmers, so this is something that speaks the most to you. Depending on the genre you go to, you're going to need something like systems and mechanics, and different genres are harder than others. For example, if you're making a 4X game or you're making an automation game, you're going to need to have a lot of mechanics, and that's going to mean a lot of code, for example. Whereas if you go for something like a simple puzzle game, then probably the mechanics aren't going to be that hard, or you'll only have to write a single mechanic really that the entire game is based upon. But there are going to be other issues with them. We'll dive into those in a second. But this is going to be the first one. Certain genres, they can massively influence how many different mechanics you have to make. And then the second thing is that you have the complexity in terms of the amount of mechanics and like complexity there, but also just in terms of how much work. Because other genres, like for example that puzzle game, they may be very simple in terms of only needing 1 mechanic, but they may need 100 different like stages or like puzzle rounds, which is just something that takes a lot of elbow grease and time. This quantity complexity is also why roguelites are so popular, because roguelites allow you to do much more in a given period of time and like a given quantity of work done through that replayability, versus making a more linear action adventure game, for example, where every level takes a lot of time and you can't really reuse them. Whereas something like a roguelite, you just create your original world generation and you create your bunch of items and you've got a lot more replayability already. So if you're planning on making a game and you want to keep the amount of pure time and content down, then think about that as well. And then the third thing you need to factor in is how interdisciplinary is your genre. So this is something where the genre and the like visual style and all of those things, they really can determine how big should your team be. If you're going to be making that open world RPG game that you've always been dreaming of, sure, you're gonna have to program. You're also going to have to learn modeling, but there's a bunch of extra things that come into mind, such as, for example, narrative design. That is something that I see a lot of studios, they want to go and get like a big overarching story in their game, but they don't have anyone with skills for that. And they don't really wanna like find someone with those skills. And that can often mean, hey, this is not the best genre for you to make, because you're going to have to work with other people that you may not have the skills for. The same goes for things like sound design. And of course, I've been taking the art aspect really broad as well. You can expand this as well in like 3D art, 2D art, UI design. There's so many things, and certain genres will need more UI, for example, than other genres. So keep that in mind as well. How many people and how many different roles, more specifically, are you going to need to be able to make a game? There's always going to be a base set that you're going to need, but depending on the genre, the amount of team required can greatly increase. Then my next 3 factors, they're all based around marketing. The first one is just how saturated is the market. This is something that you can find relatively easily to sites like Gamealytic or VG Insights, where you can just see how many games on average get released every year in this genre. If you have a genre like the 2D platformers, it's a shit ton of competition you're gonna have to deal with. Whereas on the other hand, yeah, you can go for that 4X, and maybe it's going to be mechanically much harder, but there is much less market saturation. Because of that being more hard, there aren't as many games coming out. So it can be easier for you to then stand out again. That's going to be a balance. All of this is about finding the balance that you will need to strike. And then another thing is, okay, you have the market saturation, but this is still a bit different from the concept of a market demand, because there was a period in time where, especially the roguelike deck builders, you hear this a lot, there was limited roguelike deck builders, So a lot of people started making roguelike deck builders. And then there was a bunch of demand for roguelike deck builders, even though pretty much every other week some new roguelike deck builder was coming out. People still wanted to play more of them, so it didn't matter that the market was kind of saturated by then already, because there was still a lot of demand. By now we're definitely reaching that point where the demand may be slowing down a little bit. We've definitely been saturated for a while, but this is probably the time where some other genres are going to pop up. This is also something that per genre changes a lot. Like certain genres, such as for example factory automation games, like what we did with Forge Industry, there is at this point I would say a bit of a saturation. Like there's a lot of them out there, but there's also still a lot of demand for factory automation games, for example. And then the last thing you need to keep in mind, also kind of related to that marketability, is how marketable is your genre. And this kind of boils down to how visual is your game. I know, I wish we weren't as shallow as to just be like, oh, flashy games with good graphics is gonna sell better than super deep game with kind of shitty graphics. But that's unfortunately how the marketing game kind of works. I know there are games as well that look ugly, but that are still selling really good, like Dwarf Fortress, for example. But there are generally other reasons as well that they are like somewhat successful. And even if there aren't, it's still making it way harder for yourself if you have a game that isn't the most visual, if you have a genre that just doesn't have the greatest graphics, or opposite, that is expected to have enormously good graphics that you just can't match, for example. So that is something you need to keep in mind as well. And then of course, the last thing that I have to say, or you will absolutely destroy me, is your passion still matters a lot. Like the things I've talked about were kind of in a vacuum. Don't make a game that you have zero interest in, because that is always going to be bad. Having an understanding of the genre that you're going to make may counteract a bunch of the other things that you're not really certain about. Your passion is probably what I would call still one of the top 3 most important things to consider when looking at a genre that you should or maybe shouldn't make. Also, one other thing with passion is all you need. Yes, sure, if you really want to make an open world 3D RPG, you can make one, and there is going to be a market demand for that. You can say oh, there is a high demand for this. The problem is that the market demand does not matter at all if you never even finish your game. That's the big thing that I want you to worry about as well. That's why I have those complexity factors as well. You need to be able to actually finish the game you're making, and passion will bring you quite a long way. But it's not going to be the only thing that can bring you over the finish line. At some point, you're going to have to write code, and you're going to have to make those models, and just being passionate will not be the only thing that can get you over the finish line. And generally, you do still want to finish your game, and you don't want it to be just another project in your folder of shame on your computer that you're eventually going to lose to time. So now I want you to take whatever genre that you're thinking about, and then try to break it down into those 7 different steps. How passionate are you about it? How many different kinds of roles will you need to make the game well? What is the market saturation? Is there still market demand? And try and quantify that. This should give you a somewhat mathematical formula to determine if a genre is a good fit for you, your team, and the market. And of course, this is not going to be the end-all approach, but this can still help you a lot in the beginning to determine, hey, maybe as a solo dev who has only programming experience, I shouldn't make either a 2D platformer or a open world RPG, because they're both bad. They're just bad for different reasons. One of them is the saturation, the other one is just the amount of quantity, the complexity, and the interdisciplinary rules that you're going to have to take upon yourself that impact it. Now, of course, there are also some exceptions here, and I think the first one I want to say here, and of course I need to rectify this as well, in our first tier list we put platformers at S tier, because back then I was young and dumb. I still am, but back then I was even younger and dumber. And we put them there as an S tier because we only thought about how easy are they to make, not about how good they are to sell. That's honestly kinda my bad, I'm sorry for that. But it made me realize that there's one exception where you can just skip all of those rules that I talked about, and that is if you just want to learn game development. If you're here just to make something, not to sell anything, just to dabble a bit into the world of game development, then by all means go and make that platformer. It's still a great genre because it is relatively easy to start learning how does Godot work or whatever, how do I work with sprites. And then from then on, build up your XP points so you can go and slay the bigger games that you want to make later on in your game dev career. That is absolutely fine, in which case you can ignore everything I just said, but then I would focus purely on your passion and on the complexity, either mechanically or quantitatively, but skip out on making that open world RPG, please. It's not a great idea. So you've now determined, you've quantified what is the ideal genre for you. I just want you to say one more thing. All of this, it's good if you're starting out and you're not really certain what genre you want to make, but all of this can really rapidly change when rubber meets the road. Maybe you're like us and you're like, oh, actually 3D art, we can do that quite easily ourselves. That's what we thought with Forge Industry. I was just going to learn 3D modeling and do it all ourselves. Once you've actually opened Blender, once you've actually written those first few lines of code, you'll realize that, hey, maybe I'm better or I'm worse at certain things than I thought I was. And at that point, it's okay to pivot. This goal is also just so you don't get stuck for like months on end figuring out what is the optimal game that you should make. You don't even need to wait, honestly, for writing your first lines of code. There's a link down below to a one-page game design document. Just by writing out your genre and your game and what is going to be included in it, it's a very good litmus test as well to determine, is this genre going to be a good fit for my game and my idea, yes or no? And if not, having to think about your game, you'll already struggle about some things. Speaking of struggle, if you like to see us struggle our way into game development, this channel is the place to be. We upload 2 videos every week where we talk about game development stuff, we talk about our own progress on our own games and things we learn about the industry. Also, if you aren't subscribed yet, please go ahead and do so, because barely any of you guys are subscribed for some reason, and we're making a few upcoming videos about publishing, which I think is going to be something that is really interesting for you, and you do not want to miss that, so be sure to subscribe. Anyways, that's all I really have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!